Okay, so just like Jennifer said, we are here to talk about negotiation tonight. We're going to talk a lot about the different types of scenarios that this is going to be hopefully used. I'd like to go ahead and start finding out a little bit more about everyone's perception of exactly what that means to negotiate, some different scenarios. To get things started, I said this the last time when I was in front of the group, and I think it's pretty obvious how this fits into everything that you're doing, but this is in fact part of the professional development that you have within the LEAP program. And then, oops, what this is not. I always like to start that out right away to go ahead and set expectations for everyone. So this is not going to be negotiation from A to Z. I will just tell you there is so much information that you could have on this particular topic. There are books, there are videos, there are podcasts, articles, so many different resources that you have. But what I do want to do is to make sure that you have a good overview from tonight. I hope to come across in giving you some of the most relevant items that I think are going to at least get the thinking going for you, the conversation started. Towards the end, I'm also going to provide a couple of additional resources for you. I will go ahead and let you know that a lot of the material that you're going to hear tonight is actually based on a couple of different books. So one is called Getting to Yes. You don't have to worry about that, writing it down, because I've got this on the very last slide, just so you know. And you're going to hear me talk a little bit more about how this came to be. The other book is going to be Never Split the Difference. They're both great books. Just if anybody can unmute yourself if you have read either book, that would be great, because I can't see everybody's face right now, just a show of hands. So if anybody's read either one of the books, just unmute yourself and say yes and any thoughts that you had with it. No one. Okay, wonderful. This is all going to be new material then, so that's fantastic. And you can't correct me because you won't know what's right or wrong. That's even better. Okay, so let's then go ahead and start talking about an overview of negotiation. So with that, sorry, I don't know what my computer's doing right now. Hang on a second. Can you still see my slides? Yes, okay, good. My slide just showed a really funky view, so I'm glad you weren't seeing that and just the slides instead. So let's talk about some common scenarios for negotiation. I've got some listed, and I want you to go ahead and unmute yourselves after I put these up, and then let me know what comes to mind as well. Some of you may be thinking about negotiation in the context strictly of a professional setting, like, for example, sales. That's an obvious place to be thinking about for negotiations, right? You might be thinking about it just in regards to a professional setting of either negotiation for a job or perhaps a pay increase. So those are a couple of things that are certainly near and dear to all of our hearts, but there's a lot of other personal ways that you negotiate, and you're probably doing it on a day-to-day basis all the time. So let's just go ahead and take a look at some of the different ones here. So what you can see here, the lease of an apartment, pay raise, purchasing a home or car, client, that could be in a few different ways, whether that's B2C, B2B, it could be for other types of agreement there. It could even be for something, quite honestly, as serious as politics or hostage negotiations. So there's different ones there. It could also be, like I said before, performance review, court cases. Think about it as well from a legal perspective around divorce settlements. Think about it in regards to custody of children, you know, in those particular situations. So there's a lot of negotiations, obviously, from the smallest of things to the biggest of things. Smaller, something in regards to choosing a restaurant or which movie you want to go to with your friends or significant other. It could be other things, home life that you're negotiating, whether that happens to be bedtime for children or when they're going to do their homework or get video time, phone time, I should say, I guess, and then workload with your peers. Think about it from that perspective. Maybe the only time your negotiation isn't just when you're starting a job or getting a promotion or getting a pay. It could actually be with your other coworkers as well, based on projects, workload amongst family members. So these are just some common ones. I would encourage anyone right now to unmute yourself, and please go ahead and share some other ideas that you have with this. What else comes to mind? This is how we're going to go ahead and start being interactive right now.
Hi, it's Nora. I think, there's a lot of negotiating that a lot of us probably are doing right now more than we normally would be. Obviously, times are different. I, as an adult, am home with my parents, and there's a lot of negotiating over, everything, groceries, who's doing the dishes, who's walking the dog. And then from a professional perspective, negotiating, I personally work in fundraising. So negotiating during this time looks way different than it might have even a month ago. So it's just, an interesting time to highlight negotiating, because I think for a lot of us right now, we're probably doing more negotiating than usual in our personal lives, professional lives, just kind of across the board.
Thanks, Nora. I think you bring up some really good points, especially right now in the situation that we're all faced with. And let's face it, it's around the globe. We could just be negotiating for our personal time, our personal space, just like you said, within households. I know I'm experiencing that right now, and it's not always easy conversations that we have. Who else besides Nora? Just feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Katrina here. Yeah, on that, just at the moment, I think professionally, I work in retention, so I probably never had to negotiate on paying rates from our clients. Everyone's trying to get a better deal at the moment, so I think that's a big one for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of businesses and individuals right now, quite honestly, are really struggling in this environment. They're making sure that they stay relevant. They're making sure that they can service client needs, employee needs. There's so many different situations right now. Jennifer, I do want to ask you a favor as well. While I'm running through my slides, if you don't mind just keeping an eye on the chat box, just because I'm going through my slides and sharing it. So I might miss a comment if someone happens to make that. So if you wouldn't mind, if there happens to be something there that I should be paying attention to, feel free to unmute yourself and bring it to my attention, because otherwise it might make my slides kind of not go so smoothly, bouncing back and forth between the two.
Yeah, no problem. You got it.
Great. Okay, anybody else? Any other scenarios that you want to bring up right now?
Hi, this is Maureen. I tried but failed in negotiating to get more than 2 rolls of paper towels at Target 2 days ago by saying that my family is prone with 3 young children to a lot of spills, and we're going to go through many rolls of toilet paper and paper towels faster than, say, a household of 2. I didn't really get very far, but certain things like that, you're trying to decide whether you get more bees with honey or vinegar, I guess.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point about the types of negotiation styles. So we'll talk about that in just a minute as far as which approach to take. And, in any other time, that might seem like something small to negotiate for toilet paper. But if you guys are going to the grocery store and experiencing what I am, it's not uncommon to find bare shelves with anything for the paper goods, so that's one of the things that can be really tough, especially when they've got the signs up that say, limit 1 pack or limit 2 per person or per family or something like that. But Maureen, that's a great example, because not every family's the same, and one person might be buying for 1, somebody else might be buying for 10, who knows what that is. I was buying recently for a food bank. And so when I went, I had to make sure to let them know, hey, I'm not hoarding all of this for myself. This is actually a whole extra cart, to take, because I knew that the shelves were running bare. And so part of that was the negotiation to do with that. So I hear exactly what you're saying. Anybody else?
Sorry, it's Nora again. And I think, just to Jennifer's point earlier, we kind of feel like we're all trying to overcompensate with this time. And I know that a few of us in the group have expressed this to each other, but something that we're all kind of struggling with is sort of negotiating boundaries, because this is the first time many of us are working from home, for more than a half a day, or in my case, I've never worked from home for more than a day. So it's, the texts at all hours of the night and the calls on Sundays. And so I know a lot of us have been feeling that as well. And it's, how do you kind of be flexible and be a great team player, during these crazy times, but also, have personal boundaries.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nora. And it sounds like you're bringing up something that does affect so many folks, the ones here on the phone, and obviously so many people right now in this environment that are transitioning to that work from office to work from home. So you do have to negotiate in different scenarios for sure like that. Any others? Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your participation right away. I really appreciate that. This is going to make this so much better than just me being a talking head and going through slides. So I always appreciate the discussion. Okay. So here's
sorry. One of the girls, Helena, is trying to get into the meeting, but I think it says the host has to let her in.
Thank you. Let
Heather
me go ahead and
also trying to get in.
Okay, hopefully we've got two other folks that were able to join just now. Thank you so much for letting me know that. I appreciate that.
No worries.
Yeah, because when I do slide share, sometimes it doesn't always pop up on my screen where I can see that, especially because I'm in slide view, so thank you. Now, here's a quote that I think is just terrific. I chose this person not only because it was a great quote, but because of their ties back to Ireland. So I'm curious to know if anyone knows who this quote came from. Let us never negotiate out of fear, and this is the part that's really good too, but never let us fear to negotiate. Any idea who said that quote? Just unmute yourself and guess if you don't know 100%. Any takers? Anyone brave enough to venture a guess?
Is it Oscar Wilde?
No.
Oh.
But good guess.
JFK.
Here we go. Oops. Here I have the picture. There we go. Exactly. Thank you so much. So John F. Kennedy said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but never let us fear to negotiate. And we can certainly see where he was coming from in regards to how he was negotiating in a political sense. And I'm sure many others just to actually get to that point as well too. So negotiation is very complex. I do feel that it can be quite intimidating for a lot of folks. And maybe that depends on the situation. You might not feel quite as intimidated when you're doing it for something like a roll of toilet paper, because you know that you have to have it and you don't think that the stakes are maybe quite as high. I mean, they can be, but at the same time, if you happen to have millions of dollars on the line and it means something else for your company. It could mean if it's just negotiating for something that's only going to matter to you or to a lot of different others. So just keep that in mind, that it can conjure up different emotions, different trepidation and fear for different reasons, depending on the situation and whom you're dealing with. Maybe it's the person that you're sitting across from, because if they happen to be in a position of much higher authority, that could be another reason that causes fear. It could be because of deadlines. You're fearful that you'll be missing out and you've got a fast deadline approaching. So there's a lot of reasons that the fear could come up. Okay, so I want to list out a couple of different things here, and you tell me if this is fact or fiction. Negotiations are always win-lose. I'm seeing a lot of people shaking their head no. Correct. That's fiction. Negotiations do not have to be win-lose. Quite honestly, I think that there's an opportunity to have win-win, and that's hopefully what everyone's striving for when it comes to negotiations. It does seem that there is that impression, and I purposely chose that as the very first statement to put out there, because I do know that sometimes people feel like, well, if I win, the other person's going to lose, or vice versa. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's not a zero-sum game. Next one. Conflict is a necessary component of negotiation. No, exactly. That is fiction. Conflict does not have to be a part of negotiation. Now, there's no doubt that sometimes there is conflict. There are ways that we'll talk about tonight to hopefully ease that so you're not running into it too often. But let's not kid ourselves. It will come occasionally, but it does not have to be a necessary component of negotiation. Men are more naturally gifted negotiators. Fact or fiction? I want to see everybody shaking their heads on this one, okay? No one had better be nodding on this. Definitely not. I mean, and besides, I mean, I had to go ahead and ask this question to a whole group of women, right? I would still ask that to a group of men, and I would shoot them down in a heartbeat if any one of them piped up and said yes, I assure you. So there's some misconceptions, I think, in regards to perhaps personality sometimes. You know, we had talked the past when I was with everyone around DISC, right? We talked about the different styles between someone that's more dominant versus someone else that may be a little bit more passive when it comes to conflict or just speaking up their opinion. So there could be some tendency for folks to start thinking about like, oh, well, one's better than the other, or same thing, if men stereotypically happen to be a bit more aggressive and women happen to shy back a little bit more, that there's a difference. But let's just face it, we all have our different styles, different approaches. There's not a right or wrong with that. And last one, it's always best to go with gut instincts in negotiation. Fact or fiction? I'm seeing some folks, I can't see everyone on the screen at the same time, but I'm definitely seeing some folks shake your head no, and that is the correct answer. It is not always best to go with gut instincts in negotiations, because really what you want to do is to work and determine decisions based on data, based on objective criteria, not just simply a sense or a feeling that you have. Because let's face it, negotiations, we're not dealing with robots. We're dealing with our own emotions. We're dealing with others. Stakes can be high, so it's not best to go with your gut. I can understand that sometimes that might be a tendency, or if someone hasn't done the necessary preparation, that's one potential reason for them to go with their gut, but that's definitely not the best way to do it. So avoid it whenever possible. Now let's go ahead and actually talk about the definition of negotiation. You can see it here on the screen. Negotiation is an interaction and process between two entities who compromise to agree on matters of mutual interest. I really want to focus in on that phrase right there, matters of mutual interest, while optimizing their individual utilities. This beneficial outcome can be for all of the parties involved or for just one or some of them. Ideally, we want to work to where it's going to be beneficial for everyone that's involved and not just one or the other. So let's think about it from that perspective. And let's face it, you could probably go ahead and pick up different books, go to different dictionaries, and find some different definitions overall, but I think that this one can sum it up pretty good for us. Now, has anyone heard of the Harvard Negotiation Project? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have. Anyone?
I've heard of it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kate. Thank you for piping in. Can you share a little bit about what you have heard of it? If you have just heard that there is something like that, or do you happen to know any of the framework or specifics behind it?
I don't really know about the framework or the specifics behind it, but it's something that I've looked into studying perhaps in the past, because my educational background is in environmental policy. So we did, like, I've taken courses on negotiation in terms of land use and things like that. So just, you know, personal interest, I guess, from learning more.
Terrific. Thank you for joining in with that. And listen, if anyone happens to have heard of something and not know all the details, totally fine. Feel free to still go ahead and unmute and talk through that. And I'm really curious, Kate, as we go through the rest of the slides tonight, please feel free to talk about some other things that you've learned recently in some of your studies as you've gone through that. So a little bit earlier, everybody saw, unless you joined a little bit later, that I mentioned one of the resources that I'm referencing from this evening is Getting to Yes. So the authors of this book happen to be part of this program when it first started. So the Harvard Negotiation Project started many, many years ago, back in 1979. And really what it was designed to do was to put more data behind negotiation, to actually turn it into a science. And so this has been ongoing for quite some time. You can see.
Sorry, Laurie, to interrupt you. Patricia logged out and is back in again. Do you mind just letting her into the room?
Got it. She's
Patricia
in right now.
again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, with the mission, it's to improve the theory and practice of conflict resolution and negotiation by working on real-world conflict intervention, theory building, education and training, and writing and disseminating new ideas. Now, towards the end, once I start giving out some of the resources, besides me talking about one of the books, that one which is based is on the Harvard Negotiation Project, there are a lot of courses offered through Harvard. I've actually taken some of those in my master's program that I was doing. And then also there's some that you don't have to actually enroll for, where they just provide resources. As a matter of fact, there's a daily blog on negotiation. So I'm including the link to that because it's got some great articles. It has so many different topics that take deep dives into all of the little subcategories that you might have with this. And also there's a podcast from Harvard with a really great speaker that talks about this. But this is just a wonderful resource for you. And it's great to know that some of the things that we're talking about has been studied for quite a number of years. So let's talk about some of the different styles. Anybody want to unmute and talk a little bit about your perception of negotiation styles before I start to show a few of the ones here on the screen?
I think the aggressive one, we all know the person who's got the aggressive style, and you just sort of back down from, you know, sometimes it's not even what they're saying is factual, it's just they're so aggressive in delivering it that it's easier give in than take the fight. Yeah, there you go, Rambo.
I love that, Jennifer. You led right into the very first point. And as a matter of fact, the podcast that I'm going to send everyone the link to, he describes it in this sense. And he'll talk as well about the opposite of Rambo. And I'm just curious if anybody wants to venture a guess of what that might be. But he calls the hard negotiation style Rambo. So you're absolutely right, Jennifer, the way that you describe that. But it's seeing the situation as a contest of wills. And with that, it's which side takes more extreme position and holds out longer, typically fares better from their point of view. They're really committed to winning and producing equally hard response. So when they're committed that much to their own position, it could be harmful to the relationship. Now, what I mean by that is, let's face it, when we're in negotiating situations, you don't generally want to harm a relationship. I can't imagine a situation where you want to harm the relationship anyway in a negotiation situation, because if you start thinking about it, if you're negotiating with a potential client, you'd like to keep them as a future client, right? Let's face it, in sales, that's your easiest position to resell, right? Is to some current business that you have. So once you get them, you hope to keep them. It could be in the situation. I mean, let's throw out the different ones we spoke about before. If it's in regards to a divorce settlement or child custody, you certainly wouldn't want to harm the relationship, because even though someone might win, it could be very harmful, and bitterness could really seep in overall between the two parties. And so those are some things that you really want to make sure to preserve that. And that really hard driving Rambo style of negotiation could actually not be in the best interest of those. Okay, so we talked about the hard one known as Rambo. What's another one then that you could possibly think of? Anyone want to unmute and talk about it?
Maybe like persuasion. So trying to influence people through warmth or something like that, as opposed to like getting them to come around to your way of thinking as opposed to ramming an opinion down their throat or something.
Yeah, great. So that one's a bit more of a soft approach. Does anyone want to take a guess at what the code name for that one is by this one particular podcaster? So if he's calling Rambo the hard one, what do you think he might be calling the soft approach?
Maybe pleaser?
Close, but he had a really cute name for it. He actually called it Bambi. So with this, he talked about this soft Bambi approach as the person, the negotiator that's really trying to avoid personal conflict at all cost. And if you think about this from the DISC perspective, going back to the last time that I was with everyone, you could start to think about that more from, let's say, a D and C position that was more on that one side of the quadrant where they're a little bit more comfortable in that conflict setting versus the right side that was the I and the S, and those are the ones that are a little bit more averse to conflict. But typically these could be folks that are making concessions readily, but as a result, because they're constantly making those concessions, they might ultimately feel exploited, and that's not really a good thing either. And what I thought was so great about the person that was doing the podcast, which also was from Harvard, he was talking about the fact that just imagine if you have Rambo and Bambi, that's not going to give you a good outcome because, you know, Rambo's just going to walk all over Bambi and there's not going to be results. And he said, if you have two Rambos, that might make a good movie, but not necessarily a good sense of a negotiation. So we have two. So I want to talk about a third option. And this is really what we want to be striving for here. And so with this third one, this is what's known as the principled approach. And the principled is what was developed through the Harvard negotiation project. So it was part of that. And really what the goal is to decide on issues on their merits, rather than through a haggling process focused on what each side says it will or will not do. You really want to be looking for mutual gains. And then if the interests do conflict, you want to go ahead and have the result based on fair standards. And that really is the way to preserve the relationship. And that's what's going to be key because, like I said, we're not dealing with robots and negotiation situations. We're dealing with the human side. And so we have to take that into consideration and not just be thinking of this as a zero-sum game. Are there any comments before I move on from some of these different styles and what we're talking about? If so, feel free to unmute. Okay.
I'm just curious how title and position and hierarchy in a company impacts the style of negotiation.
Well, I guess it depends on the perspective. If you're the one with the title and the position, or if you're the one sitting across the table. I think that if you're the person that happens to be sitting across the table, it could be intimidating. So that's one thing to take into consideration. And then we'll be talking about that in a little bit of how you go about overcoming that fear and that intimidation. I think that it could also be taken into account of the personalities much more so than just necessarily the position, because we don't want to necessarily assume that someone based on their title or position happens to have the stronger personality that I would say, or that they're necessarily going to take the hard approach. And so that's where I think that position simply could create the fear factor for some that happens to be sitting across from them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but to me, that's really one way that it could affect it. Is there anything else you want me to touch on from that, or is that good?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Of course. Anybody else got any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about some skills and methods that you can have at your fingertips to be thinking about as you go ahead and do some of your negotiations or start thinking about that. So skills. I want to open this up before I start listing this out. And there's actually two that I haven't listed here as I went back and reviewed my slides that are really important. So I'm hoping that someone's going to say this, although they're not ones that would necessarily come to mind right away. But when you think about skills necessary to be a good negotiator, can anyone just start naming some that come to mind for you? Just unmute yourself and say those.
I think being assertive.
Being assertive. I think I heard somebody say listening. Okay, listening, assertive. What else?
Open-minded.
Say it one more time.
Open-minded.
Open-minded. Fantastic. Love it. Absolutely.
Understanding.
Understanding. Absolutely.
Calm.
Calm. Very good.
Patient.
Patience, a great one. I think, quite honestly, when folks are going into negotiations in a rush or doing things around a deadline, let's just face it, that's not necessarily when people are their best selves. In an emotional state, mental state, that can cause a little bit more stress. So patience is important. Anything else?
It's being prepared.
Absolutely. Planning and organizing, huge. Really important for that. Because that keeps folks from having to rely on their gut instinct, which is what I said was one of the fictions, right? We don't want them to be making decisions based on the gut. If they're prepared, they won't be doing that.
Knowing what outcome you want, so like at what point you're willing to, or what you won't go beyond in terms of negotiating.
Absolutely. And I think part of that really goes to decision making, because it's exactly what you're saying, is knowing when to walk away. And so part of that is really going to come down to the decision making, because let's just face it, you don't want to keep negotiating just for the sake of negotiating. Although I will say, if anybody else like me has ever gone to like a flea market or auction, you can get yourself in trouble, because to me, I just get excited about the process of actually bidding. And so when you be thinking about that, you do need to actually set your walk away price and be set to go ahead and implement that, and don't just keep raising that paddle because someone else is. So anything else? We've named off a lot of really good ones.
I have something, I'm not really sure what skill I would categorize it under, but I'm thinking about either like research or preparation, or also empathy. I think like if you have a good understanding of what the other person or company or entity is, what the other person wants, you might be better prepared to negotiate for yourself. It's like in anticipation of that.
Absolutely. And I do have that as one of the ones listed here, which is on the empathy. And it's because you really need to put yourself in the other person's shoes, because otherwise you're just doing it for self-serving purposes. So thank you for bringing that up. So let's actually go through this list and talk through them one by one. Strategy, I'm not sure that we actually heard that one skill brought out, but let's just talk a little bit about why it's important to be skilled at strategy. Because I think when you go into negotiations, you ultimately want to think about the goal. What is it that you're really trying to achieve in that negotiation, no matter what the setting is? It could be in the professional setting, it could be more in the personal setting, but really think about what's your goal, what's the other person's goal, and just look at it from that perspective. So try to be strategic in your thinking once you get started out. The other one, and luckily I did hear some folks say this one, is around that planning and organizing. Let's just face it, you're not going to have good outcomes, especially for yourself or for your organization, if you don't go in with some type of planning and organizing. Some of that just has to do with thinking about the research for your own plan of action. And that means, you know, what's your walk away in terms of not coming to a deal? What is it that you're thinking about for the other side? What's a fair price? What's a fair deal? You know, different aspects around that. And laying out all of the different stakeholders involved. There's really a lot that goes into it. And that's why at the end for the resources, I'm actually going to send you a couple of one-pagers that you can use after this to start planning and thinking about the way that you would go about that. Active listening. I did hear someone say that one before. That is so key. And let's just face it, it's really easy when you're sitting across from someone else or on the phone or on video conference and you start to negotiate how you're probably starting to think about whatever it is that they say, and in your mind you've got that voice that's already starting to think about what you should be saying next. And active listening, I have to say, is something that probably is tough for a lot of folks. The reason is simply because so often we're multitasking. You know, we might just be busy capturing notes, and let's face it, you're not always listening if you're still just trying to think back to what they said a couple of sentences before. That's why I think sometimes it's good if you have someone else to listen in and be part of the negotiations, because quite honestly, what someone else hears, they might have caught on to something that you might have missed. And that's some of the things that are talked about in the books as well. And in particular, the one that was Never Split the Difference, because he actually says, and I don't think I gave you enough context on this one. So this book, Getting to Yes, was really about the Harvard negotiation project. This one, as I referenced in the very beginning, some of you may not have heard that if you were joining later, that this is a former FBI hostage negotiator. And so what he talks about is that anytime he was in those situations, and you can imagine what he was faced with. We're talking life and death, okay? So stakes are very high. And so what he was saying is that with those situations, they always worked in teams. So when they had someone else on the phone that they were negotiating with, they made sure that other hostage negotiators from the FBI were also listening in, because it was so important to make sure that they all were able to talk about what they thought the other person was saying, to really listen to some key words, really try to understand what their interests were, because let's face it, people might be even a little bit too emotional when they start negotiating. And so they might be coming at it a way where they're not communicating as effectively, or it could be on the other side. Maybe we're so emotional about whatever particular topic or actual thing it is that we're negotiating about, that our emotions might be driving it, so we're not able to fully immerse ourselves in what the other person's saying. And so I think that that's one of the things that's really important. Empathy. Kate, you brought this up there right at the end, so thank you for doing that. So we do have this on here, and the reason, like I said, is because you really want to think about that other side. The way that I can just put this out there is seek to understand. Now, you can't truly understand unless you are doing the active listening, and so that's why I kind of put those just one right after the other. These are kind of in order, but let's just face it, it's really important to have all of these skills. You have to have the strategy going into a negotiation and throughout the process. You need to be really skilled at planning and organizing, because that's going to be leading up to the negotiation, but quite honestly, even when you're in the midst of it, because it's not like you're just talking about a negotiation in one setting a lot of times. The active listening throughout the process, once you actually get into it, the empathy throughout the entire process. Once it gets going, really start putting yourself in that other person's perspective, to start thinking about what matters to them. How can you find the mutual interest? Emotional intelligence. Now, I think a few of you had mentioned something about being calm. I think assertiveness could maybe go into emotional intelligence, because you want to have enough emotional intelligence to determine when you should be assertive, when you shouldn't, and how to remain calm through that. But let's just face it, obviously, when we went through some of those earlier scenarios that I had on the slide, you could see that some of those could be reason to get quite emotional for one party or both. And so that's why you want to have your wits about you as best as possible. I think that also, quite honestly, speaks to the planning and organizing, because if you can start to think about what would be trigger points for yourself if a particular aspect of a negotiation gets brought up, be prepared to think that through. And also, equally important, be thinking about the hot points for the other party that's involved with that. So emotional intelligence is really key to try to make sure that you're prepared and can remain calm and ready to react. Decision making. So I did go ahead and put this on there. Jennifer, I think that you had brought this up, but it's really important to know when you should walk away from a negotiation, because quite honestly, it's not always the best to get a deal done at no matter the cost. And so that's where the decision making does come into play. The last one on the list, but I'm going to add 2 more after this one, is around collaboration. Collaboration is really so key, and it goes back to the fact that as human beings, and I think that I've referenced this on a slide here and a few more coming up, is the fact that we all basically want to have some autonomy, right? We want to feel like we have some aspect of control. And it's tough, even in the situation that we're all dealing with right now of this work from home, not knowing when the end of this pandemic is going to come. And so we still want to have some sense of control. Well, the same aspect goes to a negotiation. And that's why it's really important to start looking at this not from a Rambo perspective and not necessarily from a Bambi perspective either, where you're going to just let the person either walk all over you or you're going to be the one walking all over them. Instead, the right mindset is to come at it from collaboration, because that's going to ensure, going back to the relationship aspect, that people can walk away from a negotiation and actually feel good about it. And that's the goal, is to preserve that. Now, the 2 skills that I have not listed on here that I want you to make sure that you're adding, number 1 is around creativity. I think creativity is going to be a really important factor, because you don't want to be going into negotiation just thinking as though you have one option. We'll get to that in a couple more slides as well. But the creativity is so important because it's a way for you to engage with that other party and be thinking through ways together. You can be collaborative and be creative together, but I think that it's really important when it comes to determining options. And the last one is around discipline. The discipline to actually think about these skills, think about the process, and just be disciplined in your approach overall. So those are some skills. Perhaps you may have been thinking of some others. I'll go ahead and pause for a moment to see if there's anybody else that wants to unmute and mention an aspect that I haven't already. Okay.
Crosses over planning, organizing, and creativity is kind of thinking through scenarios. So scenario planning and even role playing ahead of time I've found to be helpful in the past.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up about role playing. You know, it leads me as well to be thinking about the times that I used to really suggest role playing a lot to trainees when I was in that situation. And this was quite honestly from a communication style, because that was them starting to think a little bit more about the other side. And you can also start to think about that role playing in more of, let's say, wargaming, right? Because you start to actually, you know, have someone else play the other person, the other party, and they need to start thinking about all of the things that's going to matter in that negotiation from that particular perspective. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that that's really important. Anything?
Hi, this is Maureen. I just have a quick question. So in my experience, like working on behalf of my company, a lot of times it's like lawyers negotiating with other lawyers and then like reporting back to, say, the business person to make the decision. But sometimes a lot of like details maybe lost in translation, or they're not giving you as much color on what is really going on in the conversation. So do you have any tips on how you can kind of employ these strategies in a way, like emotional intelligence or empathy might be difficult when you don't know the full story of something?
Yes. So thank you for bringing that up, Maureen, and for making it very specific to a situation that you could be dealing with. I think that that quite honestly goes back to planning and organizing. It could quite honestly even be around the collaboration and strategy. So if I were to start thinking about those 3 particular aspects in regards to someone that needs to be involved with the negotiation, but they're not necessarily the one that's sitting at the table, then I think that that could go into all of the prep work prior to the discussions with the other party. And so this is a great example of looking at maybe an internal negotiation process and then how that's going to affect the external negotiation process. Because what you would have with that is to determine amongst the group internally what are some of the key aspects that need to be taken into consideration once they get to the table with the other party. And so there could be things, quite honestly, that would be discussed around timing. You know, I think it's obvious that a lot of folks start thinking about negotiation from a financial perspective, right? They start jumping too soon to think about the dollar. But what about in regards to the timing of something being done? That could be something that honestly is really important for someone like a project manager, because if someone comes back and they go ahead and say, okay, we've cut a deal, we got everything that we wanted, you know, we got them to go ahead and pay the $100,000 for this particular service, but we did go ahead and say that you have only half the amount of time to do it. So was that really a good deal? Not necessarily, because maybe that's completely unrealistic. And so once again, that goes to part of the strategy, collaboration, and planning and organizing, because it's really important for someone like, let's say, paralegal or project manager or whatever position you want to put into that, to have the discussion with the litigators, the lawyers, because they're the ones that need to understand those constraints and what that means from the internal perspective. So that's one way of looking at that and how it could really shift something in regards to the negotiation, because it's not always great just looking at it from a dollar perspective. What does that then mean in regards to the internal aspects? Maureen, does that help a little bit more?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'll go ahead and pause here just to give you another real world example that I had dealt with before. And this was when I was working previously at a pharmaceutical company. And this actually was like, I think I counted it up the other day as I was going through my slides, and I was thinking it was probably 4 different negotiations that I had to balance between internal and external. And so part of that was the obvious. It was myself and a counterpart that we were working with to actually get some trials done and actually get some data. So there was that one aspect of it, but then there was the aspect of negotiating with my boss to make sure that we were all in agreement on what the project was going to be, the scope, and so forth. There was the negotiation I had to do with, as a matter of fact, with procurement and with the attorneys internally. And that was one that I actually had to start taking a totally different approach. And speaking about collaboration, I had to make sure that the other side, which was a hospital system, they had a lot writing on whether or not this deal was going to go through. Our side had a lot that was working on it, and it really wasn't just the financial component. We had some other sticking points that were just about to be deal breakers. And the timing was tough internally, and I had to, you know, go away from the principled approach and go too hard with the person I was dealing with. But luckily, the person that was in the hospital system happened to be on a conference call at the same time, and they heard that I was pushing so hard, and it made them feel like they were bought into it a little bit more as well. So there were, and then that person had to externally go to their other part legally. So I'm just talking about how complex negotiations can be and how all of these skills are really important. So that was a really complex one, and it worked out really well, but it was challenging to say the least.
Sorry, can I ask you a question? It's Jennifer.
Please.
So when you link back to DISC and what you talked about with communication styles, I mean, we talk about in negotiation, emotional intelligence being really important. For people that maybe aren't the dominant and maybe more of the Rambo or whatever, you know, if their natural style is more passive in the communication, any tips on how you balance, you know, so that emotional intelligence is balanced and not too much emotion? Because oftentimes, obviously, as women, you know, we get, you know, it's dismissed as, well, you're just being emotional. And for people that may be more passive, the, you know, a lot of times their ability to be more, show greater determination is coming from a place of emotion. So how do you balance something that you feel really passionate about And
Yes.
that may be just a departure from your normal style, so that it isn't confused as emotion and what is passion.
That's a great point. And we're going to touch on a couple of those different aspects through the slides, I think, because part of this, and this is why I really do like this book, Never Split the Difference, because he actually, I'm going to say he attacks just a little bit on getting to yes, because he says that that's a little bit more formulaic in regards to the method, and what he really hones in on is around the emotional aspect, and how, quite honestly, we can't make assumptions that the other person that we're dealing with in a negotiation is rational. We're just not. We're not always ourselves, and quite honestly, the other folks that we're dealing with. And then, Jennifer, when you're talking specifically about the disc styles and what that looks like, I think that in the next couple of slides, it's really about focusing in on what the problem is. It's easy to get caught up sometimes from a people perspective of thinking about the position, and that goes back to one of the comments that we had earlier, what about somebody else's position on the other side of the table? But position also is in regards to how you're making your stance, and when people start thinking it's all or nothing, or only trying to negotiate based on their own position, that's really where it becomes a contest of wills. And there's a few slides of talking about when someone isn't negotiating, when they just don't want to play the game, of a few tactics. So I think I'm going to answer your question once we go through a couple things. But if I haven't, Jennifer, I'm still going to come back to you and make sure I've gotten through it fully, okay? All right. So with this one, I want to talk about the negotiation methods. And quite honestly, there's going to be a couple different ones that come to place. So there's four principles. People. You really want to go ahead and make sure that you're separating people from the problem. Jennifer, I think that goes a little bit to what you're talking about in regards to the different styles. Sometimes when folks are negotiating, they can really start to just think about the other person. They're acting unfairly, they're too emotional, irrational, whatever that might be. And so that's one of the first things, is to try to separate it as much as possible. Next, really try to focus on interest. That's going to help all parties involved, and not just on the position overall. Everybody's going to have these slides, by the way, so don't worry if you don't capture everything. Options. This is really where that creativity comes to play, and collaboration. You want to make sure that you are inventing multiple options to look for mutual gains before deciding what to do. There is never a one-size-fits-all when it comes to options. And so I'm going to talk about a few things as far as creating those. And then the fourth is the criteria, because you really want to insist that the result is based on some objective standard. So we're going to go through each one of those in detail. And I know that we're up against the hour, so I apologize for that. If anybody does have to go, it is going to be recorded. So I just want to make sure that you feel comfortable that I know that you've all got your things to go to, whether that's dinner or self-care. But I'm just saying, if you have to go ahead and jump off, don't worry. We've got it recorded. We'll send it to you. And if you stay, thank you. It'll help for the discussion. So let's talk about the first one, separating the people from the problem. First, you want to consider that every negotiator has two kinds of interest: the substance, so whatever that particular topic is, and then also the relationship. And what I mean by that is the relationship in terms of, if that's the client and business relationship, if it's the relationship, like I said, between two spouses that are separating, that's part of the relationship. So part of it's the substance, whether that happens to be the dollar amount that people are fighting over, or, taking into consideration the other person that they're dealing with across from the table. And really, there are about three basic categories of the people problems. There's probably many people problems, but let's talk about three in regards to negotiation. So one is around perceptions. And this really goes back to the skill that was going to be so important here around empathy. You really want to try to understand another person's perspective as much as possible when it comes to negotiation. And that's why empathy is going to be so important. Emotion. This is the emotional intelligence that's going to be so important, is that skill set, because it's driven by a core set of interests. I alluded to this before. Autonomy, the need for people to have control of the situation, if any possible way. So that's one aspect of it. Another core set of interest is being accepted and also understood. So those are some things that really matter to folks. And so that's why, quite honestly, active listening is going to be so important. Collaboration is going to be so important to make sure that the other person feels like they're part of that process overall. And that's why the principled method is working better, say more so than just the Rambo hard style. And then also the communication needs to be two-way. Soft obviously isn't going to work that well, because that could really just put it totally in the other person's camp. Principled is really going to be the better way of going about this, but two-way to make sure that everyone has some say in the process overall. Next, focusing on the interest and not the positions. Seek to understand. I can't emphasize this enough. This is why you've heard me say it a couple times, and this is why it's on a couple of slides. You really want to dive into what the interests are. Now, part of this can be involved when you start the planning process. Hopefully some of the one-pagers that I send your way. And by the way, I've also got some book summaries that I'm going to send to you after this. I'm going to send these to Maura and Jennifer and Courtney, so they'll have them to send out no later than tomorrow morning. But I've got a little bit more detail, obviously, aside from just the slides. But it goes into a bit more detail on focusing on the interest and not just the positions. Identify what those interests are regarding the issue at hand. And a couple of ways to do that is by asking why they hold their particular opinion or position that they do. Also ask why not. If they're pushing back on something that you're proposing, ask them why they don't see that same point of view, because this is your opportunity where you can seek to understand and you're asking those questions, because then the issues are really going to start to come up to the top. You don't want to make a lot of assumptions around this, and that's why if you can ask open-ended questions. The important thing here is to have emotional intelligence, to not be defensive. I do think, Jennifer, going back to the DISC profiles and the question that you had around that, is that it might feel like if you happen to be more of an S or potentially even an I, you might feel a little bit more attacked if someone is really pushing their particular position. But this is where I think it's just important to be curious. So quite honestly, think about the negotiation process of a non-threatening way where you can come at it with a sense of curiosity to really seeking to understand. And that's hopefully going to help that. Analyze consequences. So it's not always enough to just be thinking about, well, what if this goes through? It's wonderful if you can think about that from your perspective and then also for the other perspectives of the person, but start to be thinking about, what if it doesn't go through? What does that mean for them as well? And that's why you want to ask that question. Okay, if you do nothing, then what's the consequence of that going to be? Ask that question so you can get the other person talking, because it's really important for them to understand and verbalize what happens if they do nothing, if they don't go through with the deal, or if they at least don't answer some questions that can help you both come to some options. And be thinking about a couple of different aspects. Here's some ways to think about this. Impact on your interest or potentially theirs. Will I lose or gain support? If it's the other person, you could be thinking about it from theirs. Will they lose or gain support, perhaps internally within their organization? Will colleagues criticize or praise me? Think about it from the other stakeholder, the other one. Will their colleagues criticize or praise them? What's the impact on the group's interest? So what would the short-term consequences be? The long-term consequences be? What would some of the other economic, and that could be also political, legal, psychological consequences? So these are some questions to help you start to be thinking about that through the process. Once again, this is helpful, and you can see why we're talking about how negotiation is so complex, and also why it's typically not taking place in just one setting. And then also, we talked about the importance of inventing multiple options for mutual gains before deciding what to do. Which skill set did this apply to? Creativity, and hopefully also collaboration. So with this, typically you're going to have 4 major obstacles. They're inhibiting the invention of an abundance of options. So what would those obstacles be? Premature judgment. We really don't want to be making assumptions. And so that's why it's good. Someone made the comment about the skill set of being open-minded. Absolutely. That's really important because you don't want to be making any judgments. You do want to be asking questions and keep the open mind. Do not search for a single answer. It's going to really limit you. It's really going to limit the other party as well. So try to be creative and think about as many as possible. And also, an obstacle would be thinking about it from a fixed pie, thinking about in terms of either or. That's where I said before, zero-sum game. That's not what we're talking about here. There's always going to be other ways of going about it. And then also the last obstacle is thinking that solving their problem is their problem, because usually there's a lot more involved with that one too. Okay, this is where I would like everybody to unmute yourself if you're familiar with either one of these terms, BATNA or ZOPA. Anyone? Now I know Jennifer and Maura have, because we were on a conference call and I threw it out there a little bit in regards to a preview of what this is. Anybody else that's heard this? And I especially want to address it because a lot of times once you start diving into a little bit more around negotiation, if you start to read some of the different literature that's out there, whether that happens to be the articles or podcasts or things like that, or quite honestly, if you're just in a meeting and somebody's saying, hey, what's your BATNA before we go into the negotiation with the other party, you don't want to be the one like, I don't understand what BATNA is. So this is the opportunity to learn. Okay, it doesn't sound like anybody's familiar with that. So what it stands for, BATNA, Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. BATNA, Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. So ZOPA is the Zone of Possible Agreement. And so that's why I wanted to have this nice little picture up here to kind of help you visualize what we're talking about, especially for ZOPA, because you're talking about potentially one person as far as their settlement range, because they've got this range overall, right? You've got the desired price or thing, whatever it is. It could be desired price, desired time frame. There's a lot of variables. Price happens to be one big area that people think about for negotiation, but there's a lot of others that could be here. So don't think about it just for price. It could be quantity. It could be price. It could be time. And then also the worst case. So this is one person's range overall. Worst case, best case. Then you've got the other party, and they're looking at their desired X factor, whatever that is, price, time, quantity, you know, different things like that, and then also their worst case. So the ZOPA is really the intersection that you have to where, you know, the other person may not be getting everything that they desire. You might not be getting everything that you desire. So what you want to do is to try to find that sweet spot. ZOPA is the sweet spot, the zone of possible agreement. So hopefully that gives you a little visualization. Like I said, you're going to get the slides. Now, this is an example of BATNA. So look at it from this perspective. So this is quite honestly where you're looking at this as, oops, I'm so sorry. It's hard for me to move my slides where I'm seeing everybody and then also being able to see what's on the screen. So forgive me for a couple of clicks here and there. So you're looking at this from an engineer that's wanting to get a job and the company that wants to hire someone for this position. So if you're looking at it from this perspective or their alternatives, best alternative, The engineer is looking at salary that's going to be available. So it's salary, it's a desirable job, not being off the market. Maybe it's just not being unemployed in a situation like right now. There's so many different factors, right? So look at some of their other alternatives. 100,000 salary for a less desirable job. So that's one thing. 80,000 salary at an equally desirable job, or staying on the market and waiting for a better offer. So those are some possibilities, right? There's probably a lot of other. The podcast, it's about 20 minutes long. I really hope everybody takes a little time to listen to that podcast just to continue on some of these things that we're talking about. He's the one, by the way, that talks about Bambi and Rambo. But he says, for example, when it comes to thinking about a BATNA for someone that's negotiating for a job, there's obviously a lot more to talk about besides just the salary. He said it might be other packages that could be involved with it. It could be, for example, like a moving package. It could be based on the ability to work from home and not have to commute. You could be thinking about it from a bonus perspective. It could be vacation time. It could be based on mentoring options that the company would have. So I want you to be thinking about a lot of different ones. It could be child daycare. So in other words, there's so much more to negotiate than just salary. It could be for an opportunity to revisit and then have advancement within a certain amount of time. So if you're looking at it from a candidate's perspective, there's a lot of different ones there. Now, if you look at a company's BATNA, you know, this is where they would hopefully come to an agreement here is, you know, they're looking at maybe 120,000 for an available, desirable candidate, but look at some of their other options. 120 K salary for a less desirable candidate, 140 salary for an equally desirable candidate, or continue search for good candidates. There's a lot of different ones. You know, they might have another BATNA that is none of those. Maybe it's breaking out the job responsibilities to other folks that they already have that are employed, and it's being more creative. It's maybe creating a sub-team to do the work. It could be putting the position on hold. It could be putting someone in an interim position, or, you know, creating a bonus for some of the other folks that are doing some of the work, and in the end they're saving some money with it. So be thinking about a lot of different options. That's why I said creativity is so important, and collaboration is really important as well, because Maureen had mentioned this before about when you're dealing with folks that maybe you're not always at the negotiating table, or you're dealing with somebody else internally and they're not at the negotiating table. That goes back to being creative and collaborative internally in what you work with, and then also being collaborative and creating with the other party that you're negotiating with. So I do want to pause, because that is something that I think is so important, that I do really want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with this concept and understanding, because it's going to be really important for you when you think about your negotiating situations. And I will throw out this challenge right now. I want to know if there's anyone that can think of a situation that you would be negotiating, or maybe this is something in the past, and what would be some BATNA options, some alternatives that you would have. So you could think about it from getting a job. It could be from a performance review. It could be buying a car. It could be discussing boundaries within your household. Could be any of the other scenarios that we brought up on one of those earlier slides. Anybody want to start throwing out a scenario and talking about BATNA alternatives?
I have one that I could talk about.
Thank you. I'm so glad somebody wanted to jump in and do that, because otherwise I could keep throwing out some stuff, but I want others to hear from somebody besides me.
I'll talk about like a work situation. I work in sales in retail, and the last few weeks, because of like department stores closing down, they've been like reaching out and kind of cancelling off orders. And these are orders for small brands, which could impact their business, their cash flow, their etc. So when we were in like negotiation with, obviously with these like big department stores, which you don't have a lot of like leeway with ordinarily, our kind of BATNA was, obviously our aim was to like save as much orders and as much dollars as possible. But talking through this, some of our kind of alternative options would be, you know, maybe we can like reduce the orders or push out deliveries, or maybe we can contact the the factories and see what, you know, what percentage of the production will be late, and cancel off those to kind of reduce the overall amount. So there's kind of like a middle ground for both parties.
Absolutely. I think that's a terrific example. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have one that you want to share?
Hi, it's Maureen. I don't necessarily have an example, so sorry, but I do have a question. So it's very easy for me to define my BATNA, but oftentimes it's very difficult for me to anticipate the company's BATNA. And so like we all want to end up in the middle where it's like ZOPA, but ultimately, right, there has to be a meeting of the minds. Like, let's say that my job has a market value, in this case, of $80,000.
Yes.
Right? Like, that's what I deserve. So even if their BATNA doesn't meet my market value, like, how do you go about kind of understanding what the ZOPA actually represents?
Okay. So part of that really does have to go with the conversations that you're having with the other person. So when you're talking about the company, you're talking about your own company and you negotiating with, let's say, like either your manager or HR person, right?
Yeah, precisely.
Okay, exactly. Okay. So let's look at it from either one of those perspectives. So with HR or the manager, there are things to consider. So if you were to leave, what would that be? Like if they were to do nothing, meaning they wouldn't take your proposal for increased pay or something like that, then what they're dealing with would be having to hire someone else or train someone else, or, you know, have someone that would have to get up to speed on all of the different things. It might cause disruption for current work that you're doing. So there's a lot of things to be taken into consideration like that. It could also be the fact that, you know, culturally, like I'll tell you this as an example. When it came to working at pharma, they actually had figured what it would take to get rid of someone within a year. Because I think someone had to work there for at least a full year for them to make up the cost for all of the training, for the process.
And it's like employee acquisition cost, I guess, is how you.
Exactly. Thank you. That's a great way to look at that. And there's so much that goes into that because it's really expensive, and it's also really time consuming. Like, is this something that your manager is going to want to deal with, considering the fact that they're already juggling so many things, and then all of a sudden, great, they've got to go ahead and create a new job description and start the hiring process and then onboard that. So that's why I want you to be thinking about it from all of those different ways, and also be creative of looking at a BATNA from other things than just salary. Are there other things that could be important for you or for them? You know, like what else can they be looking at in regards to additional training or advancement, or like I said, other things for vacations? There's a lot of things like that to look at on both sides.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, where this is all coming from is, I don't know about the rest of the group, but I know definitely in financial services, there's this concept of what the market value, let's say that like two people are performing the exact same job. One of them is male, one of them is female, right? And the male and the female have a really great relationship because they started at the company at the same time, and they're like, you know, work husband and wife, and, you know, now they're mentors to one another, like peer mentors. And all of a sudden, like, you're there for 5-ish years and you realize the man is making 20% more than you, right? And the man is like, you should like advocate for yourself and negotiate exactly what you deserve, because most men feel that way, interestingly enough. The reality of that is that women don't feel like they have a lot of leverage in that conversation, because the market value doesn't necessarily have to do with what a man makes at your company, but rather what another company would offer a woman for the exact same job.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about, like, in that case, do you say like, oh, well, I'm aware of the fact that such and such man makes such and such dollars, and not name anybody, but the market value of my job in this company for a man would be X, Y, and Z, and therefore you should pay me that? Or do you just say, do you take the aggressive approach in that scenario? Like, in real life, it's so hard to determine. Obviously the ZOPA is what the man makes, right? Because if they hired a man 5 years ago, they'd be paying him that. But how do you get the company to realize that the ZOPA for you is the same as the ZOPA for the person sitting next to you?
Part of that I still think has to do with the questioning. As a matter of fact, I don't want to misquote it, so I'm going to go back through some of the material, because they actually say about how to draw some of those things out. But a lot of that is where you can ask enough questions to say, well, what is it that you're basing that on? You know, are you basing that on a list of others in the company, for example, that are making the same amount? Are you basing that on something else within the marketplace? And so that's really one of your best questions, I think, is to say, well, what is it that they're basing that on for the salary? Because I don't think it's great to take the aggressive position first. I think if you can create more of that curiosity mindset, that's going to help you, because it's really going to help to build the relationship. And quite honestly, you're probably going to get more information by taking a curious approach. And you can continue to keep asking the question a little bit more until you realize whether or not they have enough data to really back that or not. Because it does give an example in the book where somebody just keeps saying, well, it's our company policy to sell a car at this price. And then you're like, well, I understand, but what is it that you're basing that on? You know, because I could go somewhere else and get a car for the same price. And then they say, well, it's because I just saw an ad for the same car for the same price. And then the person says, okay, but what was the mileage on that one? Because you're not looking at the mileage is the same. So I think if you compare that, then what you could say, well, I'm looking at this from the perspective of my years of experience at the organization compared to a peer and with the same work experience. You know, we're talking about how you've got two differing salaries. You're talking about the same start time, and you're talking about potential output. Like, those are a lot of things to take into consideration. What was the output of that other person that they had compared to the output of yours? Because keep in mind, that's one of the things that the organization might say, well, they've had much more impact here. They've done, you know, X amount of business that's brought into us. And so there's a lot more nuances besides just the time and position. So you want to be prepared with that. And if you're constantly, you know, looking at same amount of time or potentially more for yourself, or you're looking at having a better impact overall in regards to work that's been done or dollars brought in or anything else like that, or the getting recognized for performance or for culture or character values that you represent, all of those things, then that's going to give you a lot of leverage. And quite honestly, I can't help but to say this. I'm just, forgive me for reaching behind, but in my little bookshelf here, Growing Influence, this was one of the books that everybody got. And it actually talks about some situations exactly like that. It wasn't necessarily about the pay, but it was about the person getting passed over for promotional opportunities. And this helps a little bit more as well. So I'm just saying that because everybody's got that resource. And I believe I sent the study guide. Jennifer and Maura, you're going to have to correct me, because if I haven't, then I'm going to include that with some of the other resources. So Maureen, hopefully that's going to help you a little bit, because you've got one thing to kind of go through a situation like that. But then when you start thinking about how to question your organization, that's really something to take into consideration. And I would suggest that you reach out to me so we could actually talk through that very specifically. Maureen, I actually think we have time coming up anyway.
We do, yes.
Perfect. So we can either spend it then or have a second call to take a deep dive, but I welcome that conversation too.
Thank you so much.
Of course. This is really good discussion. And I love that we're bringing in some of these real world examples, because I think it applies to so many of us in different situations. Okay, so trust me, we're right towards the end. A couple more slides. So when the other person is playing hardball, what do we do? And Jennifer, I think this kind of goes back a little bit more to the earlier question as well. So let's take a look at some options that we might have. So what would be some methods? Oops, I hope I didn't just, I told you it's kind of funky for me when I have to go between sharing my screen. So what if they won't play? What do we do? Well, first of all, don't attack their position. So this goes back once again to the different styles. You don't want to be having Rambo versus Rambo. It's just going to result in egos and people really fighting for position. And we said that that's not going to come at a good cost for anyone, and it's certainly not going to be good for the relationship. So look behind it. What does that mean? Try to look at what it is that's driving them to say that. It's really good if you can kind of deflect it. That's not always easy. Jennifer, that kind of goes back to the DISC as well, because it's going to be harder for some to take that in consideration than not, because, you know, with myself as an I may be like, did they just attack me? Potentially, but let's consider it more about the interest and what it is that really matters to them. So what's really important here is not to reject or accept it. You know, whatever it is that they're asserting, you want to treat it as one possible option. Seek out those principles that it reflects. There's one good thing in one of the books where it talks about how if someone is saying, well, you're not doing this because you don't care about how this affects children. I think it was like in regards to a teacher negotiation or something like that. Then the way to look at that was to say, well, I understand that your interest is really around the benefit of the children and, you know, the opportunities that are going to be afforded to them. And so it's trying to just deflect that a little bit more and still focus in on the interest. And so try to look at it from that perspective and nothing that's going to be personal. Don't defend your ideas. What's really important for this is that you don't want to stay so grounded in what it is that you're doing. Try to invite the criticism and the advice. Quite honestly, Maureen, I'll have to say that this is even something that you could use as a tactic in that situation, because yes, it's going to be just a natural gut instinct to want to fight back for something when you feel that it's absolutely wrong on their side, but it's not going to help you if you keep defending it. So instead, this is where you really want to be open, curious, have that mindset going into it, and know once again that you're probably going to be going into it emotionally, because let's just say by the time you bring it up, you've had a lot of time to be thinking about this. It's not like it just popped in your head and you turned around and you brought it up to them the next day. So you've had a lot of time for this to be, you know, sinking in. And so you're coming at it. And so let's be, you know, real that they're going to be hearing about it and be like, oh, okay, you're going to have to listen to their side and tease some of it out so you can truly understand where they're coming from. And think about negotiation as a process. It's more than just that one-time situation. And so if you think about the process, this goes back to the skills of being disciplined, the emotional intelligence, the planning and organizing. All of those factors are going to help all of you in these situations, especially when it gets emotionally charged. If they disagree with the proposed option, this is where I was going with this, Maureen. Ask them to explain what they think is wrong with it. So this is where you can really start diving into the data aspect and really try to figure out, what are they basing that on? You know, is it something that's just tradition? And quite honestly, it could be. Maybe you're helping them to rethink that. And once again, I swear to God, I'm not trying to make a plug for it, but I'm just saying that this has some examples with that, of where there's a female that keeps getting passed over for promotion, and she really feels like her boss has a bias against females, and it eventually does come out. And I'll tell you, I've coached female executives where this has come up, and we've had to really have some good talks through this of how to play it carefully to get past that. Recast an attack on you as an attack on the problem. Sorry, there's a typo there. I looked through all the slides, I swear, 3 times. So recast the attack on you as an attack on the problem. So try not to take that part personally. Just think about, they're just so passionate about what it is. It might come across as it's directed towards you, but that's because you're the person that's right there. And just really try to think about it, that it's them trying to look at that problem. And then also be asking questions and pause. The author of Never Split the Difference has a good example here, and he really talks about this as prospect theory. And he talks about this as the principles of irrational decision making. And so those are some of the things of just asking a little bit more about that. So use questions instead of statements, because that really helps in regards to the other person that you're dealing with. And then last, and this is hard sometimes, but silence is the best weapon. Use it. Don't feel like you need to continually fill in the space, fill in the silence. Let it sit there sometimes when you ask the question. And let's face it, sometimes the other person needs to think. Once again, it might be something that you're bringing up that you've had a lot of time to be putting some thought into. So give them a little bit of space to fill that gap in as well too. And then last are the resources. So these are the books that I said a lot of the information came from. So Getting to Yes, Never Split the Difference. What I'm going to send over to Maureen, Courtney, and Jennifer are going to be summaries of both of these books. One actually has a study guide that was prepared by the author, so it wasn't just me typing up my notes. So the author actually has a lot of good stuff there. And then also some one-page prep sheets with some of the guidelines and framework that they have. This is actually the blog that I mentioned. So, you know, Kate, you mentioned wanting to really take some deep dive and learn a little bit more. I really like this blog. You could literally type in and find so many different topics there. There's ones that, like, you know, how are you negotiating with a liar? How are you negotiating with the emotional aspect of it? So you can really have it down into subcategories for all of the stuff that we talked about tonight. So that's a really good one. And then I'm also going to send a link to the podcast of one of the Harvard professors that talks about Rambo and Bambi and some of the other aspects with that. And he's the one that also talks a lot about options. So I do encourage any of you, all of you, to still reach out. You will have my contact info if you don't have it already. And I've loved the conversations that I've had before. So encourage you to keep that going, because I love talking about this stuff. And I know Maureen and Jennifer are always thinking, oh my gosh, we told Lori 1 hour and here we are an hour and 39 minutes later. So they probably did that on purpose. Maybe we really had that time all along. I can't help it. I get passionate about this. So thank all of you for still being here. What questions can I answer for any of you, or what other comments do you have based on the material and what we've talked about tonight?
I actually have a question, if it's okay.
Please, absolutely.
So what was your, sorry, I can hear my own voice, so it's kind of distracting. So what would be your advice working in a male-dominated industry? How would you get your voice heard and respected, especially whenever the males are quite older, and sometimes it's hard to be respected respected and taken seriously?
You know, that's a wonderful question. And if I were to put it again in regards to the negotiation aspect, you are probably, I will make an assumption here, I will say that you're probably dealing with a very traditional way of them thinking. You're also probably dealing with a mindset where it's never required them to think any differently, because they have probably set up particular decisions based on what was in their best interest for obvious reasons. And they've never had to go back and think through it any differently. So I think a big part of that is going to be patience on your part. So expectations, be thinking that it's not going to happen overnight for you going in and changing minds. Resilience, because it's going to require more than one conversation, more than one negotiation. And this is where it's going to be a requirement to try to focus on things from an issue perspective and not the problem, because you're thinking about it already from the perspective of you versus them, female versus the rest of the old white men in the office, something like that. So be thinking about it from the perspective of, is this an issue that is affecting just you? Is it something that is affecting the organization as a whole? What is the impact if they do nothing? And quite honestly, that's one of the questions that you would also want to ask them based on whatever particular subject or topic that you're broaching with them at that time. What's the benefit of doing something, and what's the risk and challenges of doing nothing? Those are some really important questions that you would be posing to them. And it's really important that you listen and think that through and pose that to where this is where you're trying to be solution oriented and look at this from a collaboration perspective with the group.
Great, thank you so much.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Good. And once again, I'm happy to have some offline conversations. There's a lot to go into negotiation. So it's one where I really try to drill down as much as possible for everybody, but I want to make sure you have enough takeaways. And so that's the balance I'm trying to strike for everyone. But I definitely want to make sure that all of this is applicable to your own situations.
Laurie, I have one
so
quick question. Sorry, I know everyone's trying to leave. But it sort of goes to what Katrina brought up earlier as well, around kind of the current climate we're in with people wanting to renegotiate, right? So I guess, how do you balance where you might be willing to give in on a point of negotiation for a particular project or in this current climate, but you don't want to be held to that precedent in the future? How do you balance that?
Thank you for bringing that up. That's really important. And I think this is where it goes back into having the collaborative approach and also being creative, but quite honestly, being very transparent. One of the things that I didn't bring up when I was talking about it, but it's referenced in both the books with this, is that you really want to let them know some of the challenges. I mean, it goes back to the communication piece, where you can also use tactics to say, how would I defend that, to my company, or how would I defend that to my boss? You could bring up the same kind of a situation to say, because if somebody's asking things that are like really unreasonable, because once you get into that, you don't want to feel like you're backed into the corner forever. So I think that you could also say things, Jennifer, like, we're trying to come to an understanding and look at this from a way that's going to be easier for all parties involved. Our organization right now, you, the client or vendor, whatever that is. And so we're making concessions during this period. And then once things get back on track, we can get back into the normal way of doing business that we have before. So it's almost like you're having that bit of, I don't necessarily want to call it a disclaimer, but I don't know what else to call it right now. But it's like a clause, I guess, that you're renegotiating for that. because let's just say if it happens to be potentially doing other meetings, you know, where they were face to face and now all of a sudden it's turning virtually, or services that were provided and the scope is going to be slightly different. That's where that clause is going to come in. And so that's the part that I think is reasonable for both parties to renegotiate, but with the understanding that it's for this very specific scenario. And that doesn't negate the rest of whatever situation that you've put into place before. Does that help, Jennifer? Okay, good. What other kinds of questions or comments do we have?
I think you touched on, you mentioned one of the blogs might touch on it, but if you're negotiating with a liar,
yes,
like in work, and somebody who's probably in a, like, you know, a position of more power where you just have to kind of hold your tongue,
yes,
to show like respect, but yeah, just to kind of handle situations like that.
There's a podcast specifically for that, and it's literally titled Negotiating with a Liar.
So I'll check that one out.
So I'm going to send that to you.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a list of some of the different ones that I know everyone has an interest in, but that was one that I think deserves to be called out. So Negotiating with a Liar, I'm definitely going to send the link to that podcast. And then I think some of the blogs have things like that highlighted as well, because when you notice all of the links on the Harvard blog, I mean, literally all of these little subtopics, there's different writings that they have on each one of those. Because I don't want to make you have to like read an entire book just to get some of these little snippets that will apply to you. So that's where I think that the summaries are going to help you a little bit more. And then also the blogs where you can just search for titles of the most relevant.
Is there a blog post or some kind of reading that's available for like when you're being ignored and trying to negotiate?
Probably. I will take a look for you and see if I can find that. So tell me a little bit more about that, just to make sure I understand. So I want to make sure that I'm speaking to it specifically on what's applying to you.
So let's say you're in a situation where you feel like you have a grievance to voice, whether it be at work or in an organization otherwise. You bring it to the people that you're supposed to, and for some reason or another, it's ignored and not addressed.
Okay.
And so where you would typically bring in these traditional negotiating strategies, you feel like you don't really have a lot of power to, because the initial conversation in that negotiation was ignored, and then subsequent ones were also ignored.
Okay.
It's kind of like, well, I guess they're sending the message that they're not willing to negotiate anything in the beginning, right?
Okay, so there's a couple things. When it sounds like you're being ignored, it sounds like they're really not even diving into that subject at all to be able to proceed with the negotiation. So part of that, I think, is just being able to get it to their attention in a way that's going to help you actually make the case. Because if you don't do that, you can't really get any further in the process. So there's a couple things that come to mind when you bring that up. Number one, I would say, is consider the timing of you bringing up whatever subject topic it is that you want to negotiate, because there could be circumstances of the other party that you're negotiating with. Maybe they had some horrible data that came out and they have to suddenly make some announcements to the community. It could be something that is a crisis with an organization that's going to divert all of their attention to, you know, like I said, crisis management, whether that's internally, whether that's to the board of directors, whether that's to investors. So there could be different reasons that you could be ignored for something like that, because maybe it's just timing. And let's just face it, maybe it's not for the organization. It could be based on the particular individual that you're dealing with, because maybe that person is dealing with issues that you don't even really know that much about. It could be personal stuff as well. It could be the fact that, you know, there's a sick loved one at home. It could be the fact that they're going through divorce and they're just doing the best that they can to juggle other things as much as possible. It could be the fact that they've got issues with another employee that they're going to have to put on a performance review or probation. That, you know, I'm just saying that there's a lot of situations that could go into that. So part of it is to try to understand the timing as much as possible and what else is going on at the time that you're bringing the subject up. Second has to do with how you are communicating your message. So I put this out there because I think it's always really important for everyone to think about this from an accountability perspective. And I don't want this to come across, Maureen, where it's like me picking on you, like, well, how are you saying this? But
No, please pick on me. It's fine.
Part of it I say is because I will be very honest with you and say that sometimes I struggle with things like that too, when I'm just like, why am I not being heard? And the first gut reaction is for me to be thinking about the other side, but then I have to think about myself and be like, okay, if I'm not being heard, or if somebody else said the exact same thing that I did, and then all of a sudden everybody else is listening to that person and they didn't listen when I said it, then I'm like, okay, what did I not do? Was there something in the way that I presented this idea? Was I too verbose? Did I not get the main point across? You know, all of these different aspects in regards to how you're presenting your case. So I want you to be thinking about some of those things before you jump too far into other conclusions. So the timing of whatever else is going on with the one or other parties that you're dealing with, the way that you're getting your message across. Also be thinking about the impact. So this, once again, kind of goes to your own messaging. Are you presenting it in a way that's self-serving, or are you presenting this to where it actually matters to the other stakeholders? So is it something that's going to be an issue that matters to your boss, to others on your team, to others within the organization, or even broader than that? So that's why it kind of speaks to those skills earlier about being open-minded and trying to really sit through the problem and think it through different stakeholders and their perspectives. That's one exercise that I love to do with so many different situations, is to do a stakeholder map. And so if you were to actually draw yourself, or better yet, take yourself out of it and just put the topic or the issue at hand, put that in the middle, and then have these little offshoots from it, okay? So what does that issue have to do with you? So once again, you're not part of the middle, you're actually one of the stakeholders. What does that same issue, what's the impact to peers? What's the impact to your manager? What's the impact to the organization? Whatever it is that you can think of, label all of those and think it through. Because the more you can look at it, that's helping you become more objective. It's also taking you out of it to where you're not emotional through that, but you're thinking through the lens of those other folks. And I hope that that actually helps to do that too.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Look at this. We're problem solving right now. This is great. Keep going. Anybody else got some other comments, questions, things that you want to work through? I'm here. I'm totally fine. I had some Ruffles, sour cream and cheddar, and some Diet Coke before I'm on, so I'm good to go. Maureen, you can have that second glass of wine, maybe third, I don't know, but we're here until the questions stop. And see, the good thing is that if anybody has to jump off, you're fine. You can come back and watch this when you're chilling out tomorrow after you've had some downtime and thought about it, and then you can dive in a little bit more. So we're going to keep recording anything else that you guys want to here. I'm here for you. See, and the reason I put that out there was because I didn't want people just to think if we stop asking questions, it'll end, because I don't want you to feel like it has to. I just want to make sure that you feel comfortable to ask away or to leave, either way. Going once. Going twice. All right, then I will wrap up and say a big thank you to all of you for your time tonight, your curiosity, your commitment, the wonderful thinking and discussion that we've had around this. And once again, listen, if you get off the phone an hour later and you're sitting there watching some reruns of Friends and you're like, oh my gosh, I just thought of something, then feel free to reach out and I'm happy to answer any other questions. And like I said, I'm committed to sending you guys some more resources.